The bottle that changed everything. Edward Paul wiped his greasy hands on a worn rag, the scent of motor oil clinging to him like a second skin. The sun dipped low over Millbrook, Iowa, casting the workshop in amber hues. The day had been like any other, a steady rhythm of wrenches, engines, and the occasional exchange of pleasantries with customers who appreciated Edward's knack for fixing the unfixable. Locking up the garage, Edward stepped onto the quiet streets of his small town. The roads stretched out like veins, lined with weathered houses and well-tended gardens. A wave to Mrs. Henderson and her blooming petunias felt as automatic as breathing. He climbed the creaky stairs to his apartment above Gus's Hardware, the wooden planks groaning beneath his weight. Inside, the air was thick with the familiar blend of old pizza and oil. Edward grabbed a slice from the fridge, his gaze falling on a crooked calendar hanging on the wall. July 15, 2024. Another indistinguishable day in a life filled with routine. But tonight, something tugged at him, a need to break free, however briefly, from the monotony. A flyer on the fridge caught his eye. Annual Millbrook Flea Market, tonight. He shrugged, grabbing his keys. Maybe there'd be something interesting, some old car parts to tinker with. The town square was alive with energy, a stark contrast to its usual sleepy demeanor. Rows of folding tables groaned under the weight of knickknacks and oddities, each booth manned by eager vendors. Edward wandered aimlessly, his fingers trailing over dusty book spines and vintage tools. "Anything catch your eye, son?" A raspy voice startled him. Edward turned to face an elderly man whose scraggly white beard nearly obscured his face. The man's twinkling eyes glimmered with a strange intensity. "Just browsing," Edward replied with a shrug. "Maybe you just haven't found what you're looking for yet," the man said with a knowing smile. He reached beneath his table and pulled out a bottle that shimmered as if it contained the essence of 1,000 sunsets. Edward's breath caught. The bottle's colors shifted and danced in an unearthly display, and its surface was etched with intricate patterns that seemed alive. "What is this?" Edward asked, unable to tear his gaze away. "Just an old curio," the man said, his voice taking on a mysterious edge. "But I think it's been waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" Edward frowned. "What do you mean?" "Some things choose their owners," the man said cryptically. "Yours for $20. Edward hesitated. He was a practical man, but there was something about the bottle, something he couldn't explain. Against his better judgment, he handed over the cash. "Enjoy," the man said with a wink. Edward looked down at the bottle, its warmth seeping through his fingers. When he glanced up to thank the vendor, the booth, and the man had vanished. Back in his apartment, Edward placed the bottle on the kitchen counter, its glow even more vibrant under the fluorescent lights. The etchings resembled no language he'd ever seen, more like constellations etched into glass. As he traced a finger over the designs, a static jolt shocked him. "Ow!" He jerked his hand back. The bottle wobbled, its top popping off with a deafening snap. A blinding light erupted, filling the room. Edward stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When the glow dimmed, he lowered his arm and froze. Hovering above the floor was a woman. No, not a woman. Something otherworldly. Her electric blue skin shimmered like a galaxy brought to life, and her white hair floated as if underwater. Her eyes, infinite pools of starlight, locked onto his. Edward's voice caught in his throat. "Whoa, what?" The being tilted her head, her voice resonating like a harmonic symphony. "I am Jenna," she said, her lips moving out of sync with the words. "You have awakened me, mortal. By ancient laws, I am bound to grant you 3 wishes." Edward's back hit the fridge as he scrambled for clarity. "Wishes? Like a genie." Jenna's lips quirked in mild amusement. "Genie is an oversimplification. I am a quantum djinn, a being of energy and possibility." Edward's heart raced. This can't be real. "And yet, here I am," Jenna said with a faint smile. The weight of her words pressed down on Edward. A genie. Wishes? His mind raced through possibilities. Wealth, power, freedom. But something held him back. "What's the catch?" he asked, crossing his arms. Jenna's smile widened. "Clever mortal. Wishes often come with unintended consequences. I cannot bring back the dead, force love, or directly cause harm. Beyond that, the possibilities are vast, but unpredictable." Edward frowned, the weight of responsibility settling on him. "And after 3 wishes?" "I return to my bottle, awaiting the next summoner," Jenna said softly, a flicker of sadness in her luminous eyes. Edward's practical nature warred with his innate compassion. The idea of trapping Jenna back in that bottle felt wrong. "Is there no way to free you?" Her eyes widened in surprise. Few mortals consider such a question. Most think only of their desires. Edward shrugged. "It just doesn't seem fair." Jenna studied him intently, her starlit eyes unreadable. "You are different, Edward Paul." Edward felt a blush creep up his neck. "How do you know my name?" "I know many things," Jenna said. "It is part of the bond between Jinn and Summoner." His heart raced. This was no ordinary encounter. And as the night deepened, Edward knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The first wish. Edward paced his small kitchen, the hum of the fluorescent light above barely registering in his mind. Jenna's words swirled in his thoughts, blending with the surreal reality of her presence. A quantum djinn, offering 3 wishes. It was the stuff of fairy tales, or cautionary tales. Jenna watched him with an amused tilt of her head, her luminous form glowing faintly in the dim room. "You seem conflicted," she said, her voice resonating like a soothing melody. "Conflicted doesn't even begin to cover it," Edward muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, this is insane. You're telling me I can wish for anything, and it'll just happen." "Within the parameters I've explained," Jenna replied smoothly. "Your hesitation is understandable. Many rush to wish without considering the consequences." Edward stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Yeah, well, I've seen enough movies to know how this goes. Wishes go sideways. People end up regretting everything." Jenna's lips quirked in a faint smile. "It is refreshing to encounter a mortal who thinks before they act." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You said wishes are unpredictable. Why?" Jenna floated closer, her starlit eyes thoughtful. "The energy of creation is not linear. It weaves through dimensions, time, and realities. A wish must align with these threads, and in doing so, it often creates ripples, unintended consequences." "Great," Edward said dryly. "So even if I wish for something simple, I could end up causing a butterfly effect and ruin everything." Jenna inclined her head. "It is possible, though not always likely. Simpler wishes tend to have less profound ripples." Edward sighed, his mind racing. He didn't want to squander this opportunity, but the stakes felt impossibly high. Finally, an idea struck him. Something harmless, something he could test. "Okay," he said, straightening. "I've got it. My first wish." Jenna's glow intensified slightly, a sign of her anticipation. "Speak it, and it shall be done." Edward hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I wish for my coffee mug to always refill itself with hot coffee." Jenna blinked, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing her face. "That is unexpected." "Yeah, well, I'm not about to wish for riches or world peace without testing this first," Edward said. Jenna raised her hand, her fingers trailing stardust in the air. A soft hum filled the room, and the coffee mug on Edward's counter shimmered briefly before settling back into place. "It is done," she said simply. Edward approached the mug cautiously. It looked the same, plain white, a chip on the rim from years of use. He picked it up, half expecting it to have transformed into something extravagant. Instead, it was filled with steaming coffee, the rich aroma wafting up to meet him. "That's it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Try drinking it," Jenna urged, a hint of curiosity in her tone. Edward took a sip, the familiar bitterness of black coffee grounding him in the moment. He set the mug down and waited. After a few seconds, the coffee level rose again, refilling to the brim. "No way," Edward breathed, picking it up to inspect it more closely. He took another sip, then another, watching as it refilled each time. "It seems your wish has been granted successfully," Jenna said, a trace of amusement in her voice. Edward stared at the mug, then back at her. "Okay, that's amazing. No downsides. The energy required to fulfill this wish is minimal," Jenna explained. "It will not disrupt the balance of your reality." Edward let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Huh, guess you were right about simpler wishes." As the evening wore on, Edward found himself growing more comfortable around Jenna. They sat at his small kitchen table, her ethereal form shimmering faintly as they talked. "So," Edward said, swirling his now bottomless coffee, "what's the strangest wish someone's ever made?" Jenna's eyes sparkled with amusement. "There was once a man who wished for the ability to speak to fish. He believed they held the secrets of the universe." "Did they?" Edward asked, intrigued. "Not in the way he hoped," Jenna replied with a soft laugh. "Though he did learn quite a bit about ocean currents and predator avoidance strategies." Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "People are weird." "Indeed," Jenna agreed. "But it is part of what makes your kind so fascinating." Edward set his mug down, his expression turning thoughtful. "Why do you do this? Grant wishes, I mean. You said it's a cosmic bargain, but why does it exist in the first place?" Jenna's glow dimmed slightly, a sign of her introspection. "Long ago, my kind struck a pact with the universe. We are conduits of possibility, channels for creation. But the price of such power is servitude. We are bound to mortals, fulfilling their desires in exchange for maintaining the balance of cosmic energy." "That sounds awful," Edward said, frowning. "Do you ever get a say in it?" "It is the way of things," Jenna said softly. "But not all mortals are as considerate as you. Many use their wishes for selfish or destructive ends." Edward looked down at his mug, feeling a pang of guilt. "And here I am, wasting one on coffee." Jenna reached out, her hand hovering just above his. "Do not underestimate the power of small comforts, Edward Paul. Sometimes it is the simplest desires that bring the most joy." Her words struck a chord, and Edward found himself smiling. "Thanks, Jenna. That means a lot." She returned his smile, her starlit eyes warm. "You are welcome." As midnight approached, Jenna's glow began to flicker. "What's happening?" Edward asked, concern lacing his voice. "The cosmic laws bind me," Jenna explained. "Without an active wish, I must return to my vessel until summoned again." Edward frowned. "You mean the bottle. That doesn't seem fair." "It is the way of my existence," Jenna said with a faint smile. "But fear not. You need only call for me, and I will return." Reluctantly, Edward nodded. "All right, but don't stay in there too long, okay?" Jenna's expression softened. "You are unusual, Edward Paul. Until we meet again." With a final shimmer of light, she vanished, leaving the room eerily quiet. Edward stared at the bottle on the counter, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, he felt alive, excited for what the future might hold. And deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning, a question of freedom. Edward sat at his kitchen table the next morning, his ever-refilling coffee mug in hand. The events of the previous night felt surreal, yet the warm, endless coffee was proof that it had happened. He stared at the shimmering bottle on his counter, its surface now dull and lifeless without Jenna's presence. For the first time in years, Edward felt the weight of possibility pressing down on him. He had 2 wishes left, 2 chances to change everything. But what could he wish for that wouldn't come back to bite him? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Henderson, holding a plate of cookies. "Morning, Edward," she said with a smile. "Just thought I'd bring these by. You've been looking a little stressed lately." Edward chuckled. If only she knew. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate it." She peered over his shoulder. "You doing some redecorating? That's a fancy-looking bottle." Edward instinctively moved to block her view. Yeah, just something I picked up at the flea market." "Well, it's lovely," she said, heading back to her garden. As the door clicked shut, Edward exhaled. The encounter drove home just how out of his depth he was. Keeping Jenna a secret wasn't going to be easy. That evening, Edward stood in his small living room, the bottle in his hands. He had questions, so many questions. Without thinking, he popped the top. The now familiar burst of light filled the room, and Jenna materialized before him, her luminous form shimmering with the glow of countless stars. "Edward Paul," she greeted, her voice warm. "You have summoned me." "Yeah," Edward said, rubbing the back of his neck. I had some things I wanted to ask you." Jenna floated closer, her eyes shimmering with curiosity. "I am here to assist. What troubles you?" Edward hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Why don't you just leave? I mean, you're clearly powerful. What's stopping you from walking away from all this?" Jenna's glow dimmed slightly, a sign of her somber mood. "The pact that binds my kind is woven into the fabric of our existence. We are not merely bound by rules. We are the rules. To break them would unravel our very being." Edward frowned. "That's messed up. You're basically trapped forever." "It is our way," Jenna said softly. "Though I admit, the idea of freedom is enticing." Edward's heart ached at the sadness in her voice. "Has anyone ever tried to free you? Or any djinn?" "There have been attempts," Jenna said, her gaze distant. "Few succeed. The nature of our bond requires something extraordinary, an act of compassion and sacrifice beyond mere wishes." Edward crossed his arms, his mind racing. "What if someone wished for your freedom? Would that work?" Jenna's eyes widened slightly. "It is possible. But such a wish comes at great cost. The energy required to unbind a djinn is immense. The mortal making the wish would sacrifice a part of themselves, memories, years, or even their life." Edward's stomach twisted. The thought of giving up so much for someone he barely knew was daunting. And yet, the idea of leaving Jenna trapped in that bottle felt unbearable. "You've been doing this for millions of years, right?" Edward asked. "Correct," Jenna replied. "Then you've earned it," he said firmly. "You deserve to be free." Jenna tilted her head, her eyes softening. "You would consider such a sacrifice for me?" Edward looked away, embarrassed. "I mean, I'm not saying I'd do it right this second. But yeah, I'd consider it. Everyone deserves a chance to live their life." Jenna studied him intently, her gaze searching. "You are an enigma, Edward Paul. Few mortals would even entertain such a notion." He shrugged. "Guess I'm not like most people." Their conversation drifted into lighter territory, Jenna sharing tales of bizarre wishes and eccentric mortals she'd encountered. Edward found himself laughing more than he had in years, her stories both fascinating and oddly comforting. As the clock approached midnight, Jenna's glow began to flicker. "Time's up again, huh?" Edward said, his tone laced with disappointment. Jenna nodded. "Without a new wish, I must return to my vessel." Edward looked down at the bottle, then back at her. "I'll see you again soon, Jenna. Promise." Her smile was radiant, lighting up the room. "I look forward to it, Edward Paul." With a shimmer of light, she was gone, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts. That night, as he lay in bed, Edward's mind refused to rest. The idea of freeing Jenna consumed him, warring with his fear of the unknown. But one thing was certain: his life was no longer ordinary, and he had no intention of letting this extraordinary opportunity slip away. The price of a wish. Edward stood in his garage the next morning, staring blankly at a half-dismantled engine. Normally, The familiar rhythm of tools and grease was enough to ground him. But today, his thoughts were elsewhere. Jenna's words about the cost of freeing her echoed in his mind, weaving through the noise of the world outside. He couldn't shake the idea of making that wish. It wasn't just about freeing her. It was about doing something meaningful, something bigger than himself. But the price, what would it mean to give up part of his life? Would he lose his memories? His future? The thought sent shivers down his spine. Earth to Edward. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Edward looked up to see Gus, the owner of the hardware store below his apartment, leaning against the garage door. "You've been staring at that engine for 20 minutes, Gus said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" Edward forced a smile. "Yeah, just got a lot on my mind." Gus nodded, stepping inside. "Well, don't overthink it. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to just get your hands dirty." Edward nodded absently, Gus's words lingering long after the older man had gone. Maybe he was right. Maybe the only way to figure this out was to take the plunge. That evening, Edward sat at his kitchen table, the bottle before him. His ever-refilling coffee mug steamed beside it, a small comfort in the midst of his turmoil. Taking a deep breath, he removed the bottle's top. The now familiar burst of light filled the room, and Jenna appeared, her radiant form shimmering as she floated gracefully above the floor. "Edward Paul," she greeted, her voice warm. "You have summoned me once again." "Yeah," Edward said, rubbing his neck. "I've been thinking. A lot." Jenna tilted her head, her starlit eyes curious. "And what have you concluded?" Edward hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I want to use my second wish, but I need your help figuring out how." Jenna's glow brightened slightly, a sign of her interest. "Speak your thoughts, and I shall guide you as best I can." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I want to wish for your freedom, but you said it would come at a cost. What does that actually mean for me?" Jenna's expression turned somber. "The cost depends on the strength of the mortal making the wish. For some, it is a portion of their memories, fragments of their life that fade like whispers. For others, it is time, days, months, even years lost to the void. And for the most selfless, it can be their very existence." Edward swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "So there's no way to know what I'd lose until after I make the wish." Jenna nodded. "The cosmic forces that govern such things are unpredictable. But I must warn you, Edward Paul, this is not a decision to be made lightly." He sat back, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, no kidding." For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Jenna's gaze never left him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Why would you do this? Sacrifice so much for someone you have only just met?" Edward met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Because it's the right thing to do. You've been stuck in that bottle for millions of years, granting wishes for people who probably don't deserve it. You deserve a chance to live your own life." Jenna's eyes softened, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. "You are unlike any mortal I have encountered. Your compassion, it is rare." He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I just fix things. And this feels broken." Jenna reached out, her glowing hand hovering just above his. "You are a remarkable soul, Edward Paul, but I cannot ask you to make such a sacrifice. The choice must be yours alone." Edward looked down at her hand, the shimmering light reflecting in his eyes. He felt a strange sense of calm, as though the universe itself had stilled for this moment. "I think I know what I want to do," he said quietly. Jenna straightened, her luminous form glowing brighter. "Then speak your wish, and I shall grant it." Edward took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I wish for your freedom." The room filled with a blinding light, brighter than anything he had experienced before. Jenna's form dissolved into pure energy, swirling around him in a vortex of stars and light. He felt a pull deep within him, as though the very fabric of his being was being unraveled and rewoven. When the light finally faded, Jenna stood before him, not floating, not ethereal, but solid and real. Her skin still shimmered faintly, but her presence felt grounded, human. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling. You did it." He blinked, his vision clearing. "You're free." Jenna nodded, tears shimmering in her starlit eyes. "I am. Truly free." Edward felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by an overwhelming fatigue. He slumped back in his chair, his head spinning. What did it cost me?" he asked weakly. Jenna knelt beside him, her hands gently cradling his face. "A fragment of your memories, small pieces of your past, but nothing vital. You are still you, Edward Paul." He let out a shaky laugh. "Well, that's a relief." Jenna smiled, her expression radiant. "You have done what few would dare. You have given me a gift beyond measure." Edward met her gaze, a faint smile on his lips. "Guess that makes us even." As the night deepened, Edward and Jenna sat together, their bond stronger than ever. For the first time in her existence, Jenna was free. And for the first time in his, Edward felt truly alive. A world rewritten. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Edward's window, illuminating his small apartment. He blinked awake, disoriented for a moment before the events of the previous night came rushing back. Jenna was free. He sat up, scanning the room. Jenna was seated at the kitchen table, sipping a mug of coffee. She looked different, more human, yet still carrying an aura of the extraordinary. Her hair, now a soft cascade of white, framed her serene expression. "Morning," Edward said groggily, rubbing his eyes. Jenna turned, a small smile gracing her lips. "Good morning, Edward Paul. Did you sleep well? Considering I freed a cosmic being last night." "Yeah, surprisingly well," he replied, grabbing his ever-refilling coffee mug. Jenna chuckled, her laugh lighter now, almost musical. "I imagine it is not an experience many mortals can claim." Edward sat across from her, taking the sip of his coffee. "So what now? You're free, but what does that mean for you?" Jenna's expression grew thoughtful. "It means I am no longer bound to the laws of cosmic servitude. For the first time, I have choices. I can explore this world, your world, without limitations." Edward raised an eyebrow. "You mean you've never actually experienced life outside granting wishes?" She shook her head. "Only glimpses through the desires and whims of others. But now, I wish to understand your world, your people. There is so much I have yet to learn." Edward nodded slowly. "Well, you're in luck. Millbrook isn't exactly the center of the universe, but it's a good place to start." Over the following days, Edward introduced Jenna to the little quirks of small-town life. They walked through the quiet streets, visited the local diner, and explored the fields that stretched beyond the town's borders. Jenna's curiosity was insatiable, her questions ranging from the mundane to the profound. "Why do humans place so much importance on routine?" she asked one afternoon as they strolled through the park. Edward shrugged. "I guess it gives us stability. Something to hold on to when everything else feels out of control." Jenna nodded thoughtfully. "It is fascinating. Your kind is both fragile and resilient, bound by time yet endlessly creative." Edward smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." Jenna's laughter rang out, and Edward couldn't help but join in. One evening, as they sat on the porch overlooking the town square, Jenna grew quiet. The stars above them seemed to shimmer brighter, their light reflecting in her eyes. "Edward," she began softly, "you gave up a part of yourself for me. Why?" He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the sky. "Because it was the right thing to do. You deserved a chance to live your own life, just like anyone else." Her gaze lingered on him, a mix of gratitude and something deeper. You are remarkable, Edward Paul. Your kindness, it is rare. He shrugged, feeling a bit uncomfortable under her intense gaze. I'm just a guy who fixes things. No, Jenna said firmly. You are so much more than that. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. As days turned into weeks, Jenna began to find her place in the world. She helped Edward at the garage, her knowledge of energy and mechanics proving invaluable. Together, they fixed more than just cars. They rebuilt trust with customers who had all but given up on their machines. News of their work spread, and soon, people from neighboring towns were seeking them out. Jenna's presence brought a spark to Edward's otherwise quiet life, and he found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't in years. But not everything was perfect. One afternoon, Edward found Jenna staring at her reflection in the glass of the shop window, her expression distant. Everything okay? He asked, setting down a wrench. She turned to him, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. I am. Adjusting. Being free is more challenging than I anticipated. For so long, I have defined myself by the wishes I granted. Now, I must find a new purpose. Edward stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You'll figure it out, Jenna. You're too smart not to. She smiled faintly, but her gaze remained troubled. That evening, Jenna stood by the bottle, now a dormant relic on Edward's counter. It feels strange, she said, her voice soft. To see it and know I am no longer bound to it. Edward joined her, his hands in his pockets. It's a part of who you were, but it doesn't define who you are now. Jenna turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. You have given me a gift beyond measure, Edward. I will not waste it. He grinned. I know you won't. As the stars twinkled above them, Edward realized that his life had changed irrevocably, and for the better. But in the back of his mind, a question lingered. What would happen when Jenna truly discovered her place in the world? Would she stay in Millbrook, or would her newfound freedom take her far away? For now, he pushed the thought aside. There was still so much to do, and for the first time in years, he was excited to see where the journey would lead. The test of trust. The days rolled into weeks, and Edward found himself growing accustomed to Jenna's presence. She had a way of bringing energy and light to his once monotonous life. The garage had never been busier, customers from neighboring towns arriving in droves, not just for Edward's skill, but for the mysterious aura Jenna brought with her. Despite her newfound freedom, Jenna still possessed a touch of the extraordinary. Her ability to understand and optimize mechanical systems was unparalleled, and more than once, Edward caught her fixing things with just a flick of her hand. Though her powers were no longer bound by cosmic laws, she used them sparingly, always careful to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. But even with the growing bond between them, Edward sensed that Jenna was holding something back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Jenna approached Edward in the garage. Her expression was serious, her luminous eyes reflecting the dim light of the room. Edward, she began, her voice soft but steady. I need to tell you something. He set down his wrench, wiping his hands on a rag. What's on your mind? Jenna hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor. There is more to my freedom than I initially revealed. Edward frowned, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? When you made your wish to free me, she explained, it not only unbound me from the bottle, but also severed my connection to the cosmic laws that govern my existence. While this grants me freedom, it also means I am vulnerable in ways I have never been before. Edward's concern deepened. Vulnerable how? Jenna's voice dropped, a hint of fear creeping in. There are forces, other beings, who see a freed Jinn as a threat to the balance of the universe. They may seek to contain or eliminate me. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. Edward's jaw tightened. Are you saying someone might come after you? She nodded. It is a possibility. And if they do, They will not stop until they succeed. Edward felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him. Then we'll deal with it. Together. Jenna's gaze softened, her expression a mix of gratitude and worry. You have already sacrificed so much for me, Edward. I cannot ask you to risk your life further. You're not asking, he said firmly. I'm offering. You're my friend, Jenna, and I'm not about to let anything happen to you. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later. Edward was working late in the garage when a strange hum filled the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, vibrating through the walls. He stepped outside, his eyes scanning the darkened street. That's when he saw them. 3 figures, cloaked in shadow, stood at the edge of the property. Their forms were unnaturally tall and slender, their features obscured by a swirling mist that seemed to emanate from their very beings. Edward's heart raced as one of the figures stepped forward, its voice resonating like the rumble of distant thunder. Edward Paul, it said, we have come for the freed one. He didn't need to ask who they meant. His hand clenched into a fist. She's not going anywhere. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. You cannot protect her. She is an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order. Return her to us, and we will spare you. Not a chance, Edward said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The figure raised a hand, and the hum intensified. The ground beneath Edward's feet began to tremble, cracks spidering outward from where the figure stood. Before he could react, a flash of light erupted behind him. Jenna appeared, her form glowing with a brilliance that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. You will not harm him, she said, her voice resonating with a strength Edward hadn't heard before. The figures recoiled slightly, but they didn't retreat. You cannot resist us. Freed one. The lead figure said, your existence defies the balance. Jenna's glow intensified, and she stepped forward, placing herself between Edward and the intruders. I defy nothing. I am a being of possibility, as are you. Leave this place, or face the consequences. The tension in the air was palpable, the hum reaching a deafening pitch. Edward braced himself, unsure of what was about to happen. The figures seemed to consider her words before slowly retreating into the shadows. Their parting words echoed ominously. This is not over. After they were gone, the silence was almost as overwhelming as the confrontation had been. Jenna, Edward began, his voice shaky. What the hell were those things? She turned to him, her glow dimming as exhaustion crept into her features. They are enforcers of the cosmic balance, guardians who ensure the rules are followed. And now they're after you, Edward said grimly. Jenna nodded. It seems my freedom has drawn their attention, but I will not allow them to harm you, Edward. He shook his head. You don't have to do this alone. We'll figure it out. Together. Jenna's gaze softened, a flicker of hope breaking through her weariness. You are truly remarkable, Edward Paul. Thank you. Edward smiled faintly, though his mind was already racing with plans. They had faced one challenge, but it was clear that more were on the horizon. And if the enforcers thought they could take Jenna without a fight, they were about to learn just how determined one human could be. Standing against the storm. The atmosphere in Millbrook felt heavier in the days following the enforcers' visit. Edward could feel it, an undercurrent of tension lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. Jenna, though she tried to hide it, was on edge. Her luminous glow dimmed more often now, a reflection of the worry she carried. But Edward refused to let fear dictate their actions. If anything, the encounter had steeled his resolve. They wouldn't run. They wouldn't hide. They'd stand their ground together. Edward spent his days preparing. The garage became their sanctuary, a place to strategize and reinforce. He tinkered with machinery, creating improvised defenses and devices. Jenna, with her vast knowledge of cosmic energy, infused some of his creations with enhancements, ensuring they'd have an edge if the enforcers returned. You know, Edward said one afternoon, adjusting the circuit board, This reminds me of when I was a kid, building model rockets in my dad's workshop. Never thought I'd be rigging up defenses against interdimensional beings. Jenna chuckled softly, her ethereal light brightening for a moment. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Edward glanced at her, his expression serious. Do you think they'll come back soon? Jenna nodded. It is likely. They are relentless, but we have bought ourselves time, and with time, we can prepare. Edward leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. Good. Let them come. We'll show them what happens when they mess with us. The confrontation came at dusk. Edward and Jenna had just finished reinforcing the garage when the familiar hum filled the air. It was louder this time, more oppressive, shaking the very foundation of the building. They're here, Jenna said, her voice steady but laced with tension. Edward grabbed a makeshift energy emitter, one of the devices he and Jenna had rigged. Let's give them a warm welcome. The enforcers emerged from the shadows, their forms more defined now, their features sharp and angular, as if carved from obsidian. The leader stepped forward, its voice a cold, unyielding echo. You have defied the balance for the last time, freed one. Surrender, or this mortal will suffer the consequences. Jenna stepped in front of Edward, her glow intensifying. I will not surrender, and you will not harm him. The lead enforcer raised a hand, a surge of dark energy crackling in the air. But before it could strike, Edward activated the emitter. A burst of light shot forward, disrupting the enforcer's attack and forcing it back. Yeah, we're not going down that easy, Edward said, holding his ground. The enforcers retaliated, their forms shifting and splitting into shadowy tendrils that lashed toward them. Jenna moved with grace and precision, countering their attacks with bursts of her own energy. Edward used the devices they'd prepared, their combined ingenuity creating a formidable defense. The battle was fierce, the garage transforming into a battlefield of light and shadow. Despite their strength, Edward and Jenna were outnumbered, the enforcers relentless in their pursuit. You cannot win, the leader declared, its voice cutting through the chaos. The balance must be restored. Jenna's glow brightened, her determination unwavering. The balance is not broken. It is evolving. You fear change, but you cannot stop it. Her words seemed to strike a chord, the enforcers hesitating for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening they needed. Now, Edward, Jenna shouted. Edward activated the final device, a pulse generator designed to destabilize the enforcer's energy. A wave of light rippled outward, engulfing the garage. The enforcers recoiled, their forms flickering and dissolving into the air. When the light faded, the garage was silent. The enforcers were gone. Edward slumped against the wall, his breathing heavy. Did we win? Jenna knelt beside him, her glow soft but steady. For now, they will not return for some time. The balance has shifted, and they must adapt. He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Guess that means we did something right. Jenna returned his smile, her gaze warm. We did. Together. As the town settled back into its quiet rhythm, Edward and Jenna began to rebuild. The garage, though battered, became a symbol of their resilience. And though the enforcers were gone, Edward knew their fight wasn't over. But for now, they had each other. Standing together on the porch one evening, Jenna gazed up at the stars. You could have walked away, she said softly. You could have let them take me. Edward shook his head. Not a chance. You're more than a cosmic anomaly, Jenna. You're my friend. And friends don't give up on each other. Her smile was radiant, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. You are extraordinary, Edward Paul. Thank you. As they stood side by side, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity's strength and determination could change the course of the universe. And for Edward and Jenna, this was just the beginning of their story. Nara's expression softened, their tone carrying an edge of warmth. It is not ambition, it is necessity. Your world is filled with fear of the unknown, but also curiosity. It is the latter that we must nurture. Jason sighed, leaning back and staring at the canopy of trees above. The faint starlight peeking through the branches reminded him of the night Nara had first appeared in his backyard. Back then, his biggest concern was finishing a cup of tea without it going cold. Now he was hiding in the woods with an alien fugitive, debating how to change the course of human-alien relations. If we're going to convince them, we'll need more than just words, Jason said, finally breaking the silence. You're going to have to show them something real, something they can't ignore. Nara nodded, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Agreed. What would you suggest? Jason thought for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Your tech, your ship. If they see what you're capable of, maybe it'll force them to think twice. But we'd need to be smart about it. No flashy displays, no overwhelming power, just enough to make them realize you're not a threat. Nara stepped closer, their gaze unwavering. A calculated display of trust. It is a risk, but one I am willing to take. Jason stood, brushing dirt off his jeans. If we're doing this, we need to plan carefully. Kroll isn't going to trust you overnight, and I'm pretty sure her bosses are even less forgiving. We'll need a location, a way to contact her, and an exit strategy in case it all goes south. Nara extended a hand toward him, their glowing tendrils shifting in what Jason interpreted as determination. Then let us begin. Your world deserves to see what is possible when fear gives way to cooperation. The weight of their words settled heavily on Jason's shoulders. He grasped Nara's hand, their skin warm and almost electric to the touch. Let's hope you're right about this, Nara. Because if it backfires, we're both out of options. The two began their preparations in the secluded clearing, gathering resources and mapping out their plan. Nara used the energy from the spring to stabilize their systems, while Jason worked to secure a way to contact Kroll without drawing immediate hostility. It was a delicate balance. One mistake could mean disaster for both of them. Hours later, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, painting the clearing in soft shades of gold and green. Jason leaned against the truck, exhaustion etched into his features. Despite the tension of the past hours, a small flicker of hope glimmered in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. Nara approached him, their glow subdued but steady. The preparations are complete. Are you ready, Jason Carter? Jason looked at them, their alien form both strange and comforting in the morning light. He nodded, a determined set to his jaw. As ready as I'll ever be. Let's go show them what you're really about. As they left the clearing, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would unfold next. Jason and Nara were stepping into the unknown, but for the first time since their journey began. They weren't running. They were moving forward together.